There are performances that exist in history, recorded, archived, celebrated, moments that belong to the official record of a life lived in public. And then there are performances that exist only in the memory of the people who witnessed them. Performances that were never meant for anyone beyond the room where they happened. Performances that were not, in any conventional sense, performances at all. This is the story of one of those moments. It did not happen on a stage. There were no lights, no sound system, no crowd. There was no set list, no band, no opening act. There was only Neil Diamond, a guitar, a hospital corridor, and a man who was running out of time, and who had one request before the time ran out entirely. The people who were in that room on that night will tell you without hesitation that it was the most powerful thing they ever witnessed. Not the most powerful concert, not the most powerful musical performance, the most powerful thing, period, full stop, in an entire lifetime of experiences. And Neil Diamond never spoke about it publicly, not once, not in any interview, any documentary, any authorized biography. The moment belonged to the man it was given to. And that, perhaps, tells you everything you need to know about who Neil Diamond actually was beneath the legend. But to understand what that night meant, you have to understand something about the relationship between music and the moments when ordinary language fails completely. Neil Diamond had understood this from the beginning, from the teenage years in Brooklyn when he first picked up a guitar and discovered that it could carry feelings that words alone could never hold. From the years of writing songs for other artists, watching his emotional honesty go out into the world in other people's voices. From the long, grinding climb through small venues and in different audiences toward the career that Sweet Caroline finally cracked open. He had always known that music was not entertainment. Not primarily, not essentially. Entertainment was what it looked like from the outside, from the inside, from the place where the songs actually came from. It was something far more necessary than that. It was the reaching of one human being toward another across whatever distance lay between them. The attempt to say the true thing. The refusal to let the most important feelings go unnamed. He had built an entire career on that belief, had filled arenas around the world with audiences who came to his shows not merely to be entertained, but to feel something they could not feel anywhere else. To stand in a room with thousands of strangers and discover, through 3 minutes of a shared song, that they were not as alone as ordinary life made them feel. But none of that had prepared him for the phone call that came on a Tuesday afternoon in the mid-1980s when he was between tour dates and staying at his home in Los Angeles. The call came from a woman named Margaret. She was not a music industry contact. She was not a journalist or a promoter or anyone connected to the professional machinery of Neil Diamond's life. She was a wife whose husband, Robert, was lying in a hospital bed in a room that the doctors had recently indicated he would not be leaving. Robert was 53 years old. He had worked his entire adult life as a high school music teacher in a small town outside of Chicago. He had taught generations of teenagers to love music, had put instruments in the hands of children who had never considered that music might be something they could make rather than just receive, and had watched some of those children go on to build entire lives around what he had given them. He was also, Margaret told Neil's assistant when she first called, the most devoted Neil Diamond fan she had ever known. Had been since the late 1960s, when Sweet Caroline came on the radio and something in it reached him in a way he could never fully explain. He had every album. Had seen Neil perform live 11 times over the decades. Had, in the way of truly devoted fans, built a kind of private relationship with the music that existed entirely independently of the artist. A relationship in which the songs had become the language for things Robert himself could not always say directly. Margaret's request was simple and, in its simplicity, almost impossible to process. Robert was asking whether Neil Diamond might come and sing for him. Not at a concert, not at a charity event. In his hospital room, before the end. Neil Diamond's assistant had handled unusual requests before. The machinery of celebrity generates them constantly. Requests that range from the merely eccentric to the genuinely moving. Most of them for reasons of time and logistics, and the basic impossibility of one person meeting every need directed at them, go unfulfilled. That is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. But something about this request moved through the usual channels differently. The assistant brought it directly to Neil. Read him Margaret's letter. Because she had written a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, describing Robert's life and his illness, and the specific way Neil Diamond's music had been woven through the decades of their marriage, the songs that had played at their wedding, the album that had gotten Robert through the death of his father, the concert they had attended on their 20th anniversary sitting in the front row. Robert singing along to every word with tears running freely down his face and no embarrassment about it whatsoever. Neil listened to the letter being read. He did not interrupt. When it was finished, he sat quietly for a moment. He thought about Robert teaching music to teenagers in a small town outside of Chicago. He thought about what it meant to spend an entire professional life putting instruments in the hands of young people who had no idea yet what music could do for them. Teaching them not just the technical dimensions of sound but the emotional dimension, the part that mattered most and was hardest to explain. He thought about the particular dedication that required, the daily, unglamorous, largely unacknowledged work of someone who believed in music's capacity to change lives and organized his entire career around the belief, without ever standing in a spotlight. In a way, he thought, Robert had been doing something not entirely unlike what he had been doing. Just from the other side of the equation, Neil had made the music. Robert had given it to people who needed it. Both of them were in service of the same thing, the idea that the most important human feelings deserved to be named, carried, and shared, that nobody should have to carry them entirely alone. He thought about Margaret writing that letter, 3 handwritten pages, describing her husband's life and the way Neil's songs had been threaded through it. Not as soundtrack but as language, as the specific vocabulary Robert reached for when his own words ran out. He thought about what it cost her to write it. The combination of hope and vulnerability, and love that would have been required to put those pages in an envelope and send them to a stranger. He thought about what it would mean to Robert if he went, and what it would mean if he didn't. Then he said, find out which hospital, find out which room, and find out when visiting hours are. His assistant started to raise the practical considerations, the security implications, the precedent it might set, the schedule conflicts. Neil stopped him with a single quiet sentence. This is not a complicated decision, he said. 3 days later, Neil Diamond drove himself to a hospital outside of Chicago. No publicist, no security team, no camera crew. He carried his acoustic guitar in its case and wore the kind of clothes a person wears when they are not trying to look like anyone in particular. He told the front desk his name, asked for Robert's room number, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Margaret was waiting in the corridor outside the room. She had not told Robert he was coming. She had been afraid that if Robert knew and then something prevented it, the disappointment would cost him something he could not afford to spend. So she had kept the secret for 3 days, carrying it alone, not knowing until that moment in the corridor whether she was about to witness something miraculous or deliver the news that it had fallen through. When she saw Neil Diamond walking toward her with a guitar case in his hand, she put both hands over her mouth and could not speak. Neil took her hands gently. He asked how Robert was doing. She told him honestly. Not well, but present, awake more than asleep, still himself in the ways that mattered. Still, she said, humming Neil Diamond songs under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. Neil nodded. Then he asked if he could go in. The room was small and institutional, the kind of room that hospitals build for function rather than comfort. Fluorescent lighting softened slightly by a lamp Margaret had brought from home, a window showing a grey November sky, get-well cards arranged on the windowsill, with the careful optimism of people who are not sure what else to do. Robert lay in the bed, thinner than his photograph suggested, but with eyes that were, as Margaret had promised, entirely present. He looked at the door when it opened. He saw his wife come in, and then he saw who was behind her. For a moment, Robert did not move, did not speak. His expression passed through something that had no single name. Recognition, disbelief, a complex emotion that sat at the intersection of joy and grief and gratitude, and the particular feeling of receiving something so far beyond what you had allowed yourself to hope for, that your nervous system doesn't quite know how to process it. Neil set his guitar case on the chair beside the door, opened it, and took out the guitar. He pulled a stool from the corner of the room and sat beside the bed, close enough that Robert could reach out and touch the guitar if he wanted to. Is there something you'd like to hear? Neil asked. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, his voice quieter than it had once been but completely steady. You know the one. Neil smiled. He began to play the opening chords of Sweet Caroline. He did not sing it the way he sang it in arenas. He did not sing it the way he sang it for radio or for recordings or for the thousands of people who knew every word. He sang it the way it had been written. Quietly, intimately. in the register of a conversation rather than a performance. The way it might have sounded in a Boston hotel room at 3 in the morning, if anyone had been there to hear it. Robert closed his eyes. His lips moved along with the words, silently at first, then with more sound, until by the chorus he was singing too. Softly, imperfectly, with a voice that illness had diminished but not silenced. His hand found Margaret's on the blanket and held it. Margaret was crying. The nurse who had been monitoring Robert's vitals from the doorway was crying. Neil Diamond, by his own later account in a private conversation with a close friend, was doing everything in his power not to cry, because he wanted to keep singing, and crying would have made that harder. He sang Sweet Caroline all the way through. Then, without being asked, he went directly into another song. And then another. He played for 45 minutes in that small hospital room, working through the songs that Margaret's letter had mentioned. The ones that had been present at the significant moments of Robert and Margaret's life together. The ones that had served as the private language of their marriage. The ones that had carried what they could not always say directly. He played Song Sung Blue, and Robert's hand tightened on Margaret's. He played Holly Holy, and a nurse in the doorway covered her mouth with her palm. He played I Am, I Sighed. The longing and searching in it almost unbearable in that context, that song about a man caught between who he was and who he needed to become, resonating differently in a room where the future had been reduced to weeks. And Robert sang the chorus in a voice that was barely a whisper but was entirely present, entirely committed, entirely himself. Between songs, there was no silence. The room held something that silence would have disrupted. Neil moved from one song to the next, with the instinct of someone who understood that the music itself was doing necessary work and that pausing too long would break something fragile and irreplaceable. He did not announce the songs. He simply played them. And the room received each one with a specific quality of attention that belongs to people who understand that what they are experiencing is singular and will not come again. The corridor outside the room had filled, quietly, with nurses and orderlies and other patients in robes who had followed the sound without quite believing what they were hearing. Nobody came in. They stood in the doorway and in the hall, listening, a small accidental congregation gathered around something that had not been planned and could not be repeated. One of the nurses would describe it later, to a colleague who had not been there, as the quietest thing she had ever heard in a hospital. Not quiet in volume. Neil Diamond's voice filled the room easily, even unplugged, even restrained, even singing for one person rather than thousands. Quiet in a different sense. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. Quiet the way a room feels when everyone in it understands, simultaneously and without discussion, that something is happening that they will remember for the rest of their lives. When Neil finally set the guitar down, Robert opened his eyes. "Thank you," he said. His voice was very quiet. "That's the best concert I've ever been to. And I've been to 11. Neil laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that arrives unexpectedly and cannot be manufactured. He reached out and put his hand briefly on Robert's arm. "You've got good taste," he said. He stayed for another hour, not playing, just talking. Robert asked him questions about the songs, where they had come from, what he had been thinking when he wrote certain lines, whether particular lyrics meant what Robert had always assumed they meant. Neil answered honestly and at length, the way a person answers when they understand that the conversation matters and time is not something to be wasted on approximation. Robert asked about Sweet Caroline specifically, about the Boston hotel room, about the 3 in the morning honesty of it, about whether Neil had known, when he wrote it, that it would become what it became. Neil told him honestly that he had not known anything except that the song was true. That truth was the only standard he had ever been able to apply. That he had written it from the most broken place inside himself, and had been genuinely astonished when the world received it as a celebration. Robert thought about this for a moment. Then he said something that Neil would carry with him for the rest of his life. "That's exactly why it works," Robert said. "Because you can hear the broken place underneath it. The song is joyful because it came from somewhere that needed joy. People feel that. They don't know they feel it, but they do. That's what I've tried to teach my students for 30 years. The most honest music always has a shadow in it. The shadow is what makes the light visible." Neil looked at him for a long moment. He had spent decades thinking about music, writing about it in interviews, discussing it with producers and collaborators and fellow artists. And this man, this high school music teacher from a small town in Illinois, lying in a hospital bed with weeks left to live, had just articulated something about his own work that he had never quite found the words for himself. He told Robert that, directly and without any of the deflection that public figures learn to deploy when a conversation gets too close to something real. Robert smiled. "You gave me the songs," he said. "The least I can do is tell you what they meant." They talked about music for the rest of that hour. Not about the industry or the charts or the machinery of career. About music itself. What it was for, why it mattered, what it could do that nothing else could. Robert talked about his students the way Neil talked about his audiences, with the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of someone who had spent their life in service of something larger than themselves and had seen that service produce real results in real people's lives. Two men who had spent their careers on opposite sides of the same essential work, discovering in a hospital room in November that they had been building toward the same thing all along. When he left, he embraced Margaret in the corridor. She tried to find words adequate to what had just happened and could not. He told her she did not need to find them. He told her that the letter she had written had been one of the most beautiful things anyone had ever sent to him, and that he was grateful she had trusted him with it. He drove back to his hotel alone. He did not call his publicist. He did not mention what had happened to his management team. The moment belonged to Robert and Margaret, and he had no intention of allowing it to become anything else. He sat in his hotel room that evening with the guitar across his knees and did not play anything. He simply sat with what the afternoon had given him. The image of Robert's face when he first appeared in the doorway. The sound of Robert's voice joining the chorus of Sweet Caroline, diminished by illness but utterly committed. The conversation about shadows and light and the broken places underneath joyful songs. He thought about the thousands of shows he had played in his career. The arenas and the stadiums and the television appearances and the recording sessions. The official, documented, archived performances that constituted the public record of his life as an artist. And he thought about how none of them, not one, not the most celebrated or the most attended or the most commercially successful, had felt quite like 45 minutes in a small hospital room in Illinois with nobody watching except a woman who loved her husband and a corridor full of nurses who had followed the sound of a guitar. There is a difference, he understood, between being heard and being listened to, between performing for thousands and singing for one, between the music that fills arenas and the music that fills the specific, irreplaceable silence of a room where someone is running out of time. Both mattered. He had never doubted that both mattered. But they mattered differently, and that difference was something he would carry from that November afternoon into every performance that followed. Robert passed away 6 weeks later. Margaret wrote to Neil again, a shorter letter this time, to let him know. She told him that in the weeks after his visit, Robert had talked about that afternoon constantly, had described it to every nurse, every doctor, every family member who came to visit, had called it, without any apparent awareness of how extraordinary the statement was, the nicest thing anyone had ever done for him. She told Neil one more thing. In Robert's final days, when he was sleeping more than he was awake, she had played Neil Diamond's music softly in the room, and even in the deepest sleep, she said, when Robert heard Sweet Caroline, his lips moved. He still knew every word. He knew them until the very end. When Neil received that letter, he was preparing for a concert in New York. A sold-out show at a major venue. Thousands of people, all the machinery of a major touring production assembled and ready. He read the letter in his dressing room, alone, and sat with it for a long time. Then he walked out onto that stage and sang to those thousands of people with everything he had. Every song full and committed and alive. Because that is what Robert would have wanted from him. Not grief, not holding back, not the diminishment of what he did for the thousands of people who came to those shows carrying their own private reasons for being there. But somewhere in the set that night, when Sweet Caroline began and the crowd erupted the way crowds always erupted for that song, Neil Diamond sang it slightly differently than usual, slightly quieter in the verses, more intimate, as if he were singing it, just for a moment, not to the thousands of people in front of him, but to one man in a small hospital room in Illinois, who had closed his eyes and followed every word home. Nobody in the audience would have noticed the difference, but it was there, and it was everything.